We have our last speaker, Mr. Bill Gerling from IHA, International Hydropower Association.
Thanks very much. Well, everything I've heard on our panel so far is very consistent with what I think you're going to hear from the hydropower perspective, so I'm glad about that. My presentation is going to be kind of two parts. I'm going to talk about climate resilience guidelines, and those of you who saw my presentation before lunch heard some of the preamble to that. Now I'm going to talk to you a little more detail about the guidelines. And the second part of it, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing in project financing that relates to building resilient climate resilient hydropower projects. So I'm just going to start with a quick background on the climate resilience guidelines and where our involvement came from in terms of working with World Bank, what the key steps are, but I'm not going to go through the actual guidelines in detail. You're going to be seeing some products come out of IHA in the not too distant future that will give you all kinds of information on what the steps are in climate resilience guidelines, but I'll walk you through it. And then, as I mentioned, I'll just talk briefly about some financial instruments that some of you may be familiar with, something called the Hydropower Preparation Support Facility, a concept we're trying to promote, and some work we're doing with the Climate Bonds Initiative. So first, who's engaged in checking climate resilience for hydropower projects? Who are the leading agencies that we're working with? Currently, it's World Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. A couple of others are getting some interest, the Inter-American Development Bank as well. But the lending agencies are predominantly who's driving our work on climate resilience right now. The Green Bond Financing Agencies, the one we're working with in particular is the Climate Bonds Initiative, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about. Obviously the scientific community, and all of the utilities are really interested. I've just shown a couple from Canada and EDF from France who are very active right now in working in climate resilience. Climate resilience from a hydropower perspective really begins at the basin planning scale. It's all about looking at the region you're working in, and if you're working with a greenfield project like Timothy may have been talking about in Africa, you start back at the energy plan and the basin plan, and you look at where it is best to build hydropower in that region. So it's about planning the entire energy system together, knowing where wind and solar are going to be built, where other forms of electricity are going to be built or are already existing, and how hydropower fits into that mix. Particularly looking at where is storage needed, what are the energy needs of the country, is there a requirement for reservoir storage to supply not only electricity, but to supply water supply and irrigation, for instance. So it's very important that climate resilience begins at the basin planning scale. Can't emphasize enough the need for reservoir storage for climate resilience. We've heard a number of situations where countries may be looking at some vulnerability to rainfall events, to precipitation, where it may be uncertain as to whether their firm supply is going to be continuing as it has in the past. And that's where reservoir storage comes in. It's about building that battery for your hydropower projects so that when you have a limited supply and extended drought, your reservoir storage is there to back it up. And of course, it's about building resilience into design as well. The key features of a hydropower project have always considered the variability in inflows for things like spillway design floods. And now, of course, there's an additional layer on top of that that looks at perhaps an even greater extreme flood. Building flexible operating into your system, so having the ability to operate over a wider range of possible conditions. That's always considered now in project design, and even in rehabilitating projects, you're considering now additional flexibility, which is the next point, building resilience in the modernization. We saw an example this morning from Craig Davies of EBRD where they have done just that. And the last part is something I spoke to very briefly in the question period about sustainability assessments. When we're doing a project and we get a sustainability assessment done using our protocol, we're now including a climate resilience component in that. So to the guidelines, the World Bank was really the initiator of this. They've had in their portfolio something they call the decision tree framework, which they have used in other infrastructure, and they wanted to start looking at climate resilience for hydropower projects that they're involved in. In fact, they are required to now. And this process is a bottom-up process, starting with just basically engineering principles: project screening, initial analysis, climate stress, and then climate risk management, following the typical engineering pre-feasibility, feasibility, and design stages. There's nothing really that's that revolutionary. It's just that it's organized in a way that it's quite easy to follow through, and it's conducive to preparing a set of relatively simple guidelines that is what we're hoping to produce in the next short little while. And it's there to enhance existing hydropower design and implementation standards. It's not reinventing the process at all. It's really there just to augment what we've already done, we've always done traditionally. So this is it in a nutshell. There's 4 phases to the decision tree framework. Those are the ones in dark blue: project screening, initial analysis, the climate stress test, and then climate and disaster risk management. And at each of these steps, there's a number of questions asked. And of course, prior to that, there's really a project, a preparation of information where you're gathering knowledge about the climate, knowledge about existing climate models that may have been run in the area, and really preparing the project, and then going through these sequential steps, looking at is the project climate sensitive, is climate a dominant factor, which in almost all cases of a hydropower project, the answer will be yes, and then carrying on with the actual detailed analysis from that point onward to do scenarios, evaluating various different types of models and elements of the project, not just hydrologic risk, but all elements of the hydropower project under this climate stress test. And then looking at, can the project cope with the potential changes? So this is where actual design changes are implemented, solutions, and adaptation strategies. And then it's followed up with a monitoring, reporting, and evaluation phase. So this is to demonstrate that the project will perform under the range of extremes that you've considered, and this can be in various phases. It can be in the first 5 years, and it can be stretched out over a longer term. And it's starting right through the construction of the project and into the operation and maintenance phase. So that was a quick blast through the guidelines, and as I said, I could spend a lot of time going through it with you, but I thought it would be more helpful for me to talk a bit more about some of the other things we're going to be doing and what are the next steps. So we're hoping to have the guidelines, we're working with World Bank on this right now, to have the guidelines ready by the end of this month. We're also developing from this work a set of concise criteria for the assessment of green bonds under the Climate Bonds Initiative, and this will be more of a checklist. It'll be, have you done your due diligence on this step, right through that process. And I think I described that in my presentation earlier before lunch. And the second part of it is we're going to be, as I mentioned, building climate resilience into the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol. It's going to have its own climate resilience element. Again, it will be an examination of how resilient is this project. Have you done all your due diligence to ensure that it will be resilient? Now, it doesn't necessarily have to have all the analysis done at that stage. It's more of a check to see that you have examined that project. And if there are glaring issues with where it's sited, issues that make it look as though it's a very bad project, it'll get a low score. But if it's been cited properly and it's got some analysis in the works, it'll probably get a high score. And then the last thing is to publish industry good practice guidelines on climate resilience. And this is going to be a step down the road. We're going to be working with the World Bank and other development banks to extract the best information, and of course operators in the power sector as well. I'm now going to shift to a different element, talk to you a little bit about some of the work we're doing on project financing. I've heard a number of times that there's some issues with getting private sector engagement in project preparation. And this is really the foundation of why we got involved in this element. And I'll introduce the concept of the project preparation support facility in a second, but it's really that because historically project financing was the responsibility of the public sector. So this is now, we're seeing a fundamental shift due to deregulation that, you know, there's now finite public funds and private finance are really seeking to get involved in this. So there's been a number of different models that have worked, but with the hydropower sector, it's somewhat unique in that there's that high capital intensive upfront cost that has to be dealt with, and it's very difficult to get proper pre-feasibility studies done by the private sector on hydropower projects. The result of not putting in the proper upfront costs is that what will happen is they'll invest in smaller run-of-river projects that can reduce risk, but they're not conducive to maximizing the wider benefits of hydropower. In other words, they will go past the larger hydropower project with storage just to avoid the risk. And this is not unfamiliar to you. I mean, in the private sector, the main barriers and risks to investment are pretty well known. It's this high capital intensive aspect and the political and payment risk aspect. Are they going to get paid? The public sector, it's a different set of concerns. It's the potential lack of control, projects not being built in the right way, in the right place, not aligning with the country's wider energy plan. And then the issue of inflated tariffs that can create issues in the public sector as well. So the concept that we have been working on, we call the Hydropower Preparation Support Facility. And it's really asking this question: how can we reduce the hydropower's high risk profile for both the public and private sector, largely for the private sector? And the concept is that we wanted to provide this, we call it a facility. It's not a physical entity, it's really a fund. To fund, nurture, and develop sustainable project blueprints that would obtain the necessary approvals with government involvement that would be the best strategic fit within existing systems. So the concept is to get an injection of money at the front end to remove that risk and basically prepare a footprint, a blueprint that is project ready so that private investors will come in and take up this project more readily. I won't go through this very complicated schematic, but the concept is fairly simple, is that at the front end of the project, which is this is the project life cycle going from pre-feasibility on the left-hand side through to operation on the right-hand side. And if there's a proper injection of this fund, which I don't have a pointer, which is seen to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of the project cost, you remove the risk, the project upfront risks from the private developer. And they are more readily going to take up the right kind of project in the right place and be prepared to move forward with development of it. And then the concept is the revolving fund. So when the project is in operation, there's a revenue payback, and that can basically pay back essentially the loan. It's not an uncommon concept. It's just something we've been extracting from other concepts. Like I've got some examples here. NEPAD in Africa has been doing some work around this. There's a project called the Sustainability Energy Fund for Africa, and there's a number of others. But they have not been focusing on hydropower. There's been very little focus on multi-purpose hydropower, so this is where IHA comes in, and we want to promote the idea of doing the same concept for a hydropower project. We firmly believe that this will really incite more private investment in hydropower projects in the right place. So I won't go into greater detail. We've had quite a bit of discussion with World Bank, and interesting, we've been talking to African Development Bank, Timothy, so we do think that the work that you were talking about in your presentation is an ideal situation. There's not a lot of infrastructure on hydropower built in Africa yet, so it's a perfect opportunity to demonstrate this with a demonstration project. And I'll finish on this. I mentioned the Climate Bonds Initiative. We recognize this is a new funding source for hydropower projects, but green bonds have not been exclusively set up for hydropower projects in too many different entities. In this particular one, Climate Bonds Initiative, they are asking IHA to prepare what they're calling eligibility criteria for hydropower. So our CEO was involved in the technical working group developing the criteria for climate compatible hydropower. And again, this is all about getting hydropower projects that are climate resilient and bankable, ready for financing. There are 3 elements to the Climate Bonds Initiative. There's a mitigation element where they are going to be asking us to provide transparency on the impact of that project and the reservoir emissions that can be created by that project. And I mentioned this morning we have this GRES tool that will be used for that. There's a resilience and adaptation component, which is the criteria I told you about this morning, and we are working on to prepare a set of checklists, again, for is the project resilient. And then there's a social environmental consideration where they'll be using the protocol as a means for examining, checking the environmental and social aspects of the project. So we think this is extremely important, and it's an opportunity that we really have to get going on, because they're asking for this by the end of the year, and we're afraid that hydropower might miss the boat if we don't get going. So this is the next steps on our work on the project preparation support facility. And, oh, I'm sorry, I went backwards. So I'll end there. That's essentially where we're at with the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I'll be willing to take any questions you have about either of the initiatives and the climate resilience guidelines. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was also a very interesting presentation. Hydropower is a very important issue, and they have a lot of potential. And in most of the cases, in some cases, there are other impacts of hydropower, be it environmental or other cross-border impacts that we have to also take into consideration. And this is something that is not in our focus here, but hydropower has a lot of potential in most countries and regions. So now we have